Today we're going to look at the Arab Empire, Key Concept 3.2, which talks about continuity and innovation when it comes to state forms and their interactions. And more specifically, we're going to get into Roman numeral I, which is the collapse and reconstitution of different empires in some regions where we see the formation of new states. And then B, as part of Roman numeral I, looks at the new forms of governance emerging, including those in various Islamic states. Before you do this PowerPoint, I would recommend that you do the Islam as a religion PowerPoint that Ms. Rodriguez did. That's going to give you a couple of key terms and some background knowledge that you will need to further advance this PowerPoint. The Arab Empire, as we know it, and we'll cover it during this time period, is going to be a very widespread stretch from modern-day Spain all the way to modern-day India, covered in that map there to the right. And you can kind of compare that to the Byzantine Empire that we just came from, as far as how large and realm of influence. These areas that are going to be extended will cover two different continents and other areas in between. Basically, it's going to take over or part of the following empires or civilizations: Egypt, Rome, Byzantium, Persia, Mesopotamia, parts of India. It's going to be a lot of massive, widespread movement and diffusion. And of course, when we talk about diffusion and spread, you have to look at things like faith and religion, language, and other cultural identities here. So the culture of Arabia definitely needs to be discussed further. Once again, you should probably look at the Islam as a religion PowerPoint first before you get to this one. Now, of course, war and conquest is going to be the main focal point of our initial discussion. After Muhammad's death in 630, you've got a period where in the 50s, 650s to be exact, the Arab forces are going to be moving throughout the initial area of this Islamic world here, centered around Mecca, Medina, those places in the Arabian Peninsula. They're going to move around and start defeating places like the Persian Empire. They're going to take over almost half of Byzantium's territories because obviously they're very weak, as you probably have already seen through that lecture and covering material. And around the early 700s, you've got Africa being the focal point here. They sweep through northern Africa along the Mediterranean, taking over all those Bedouin tribes and stuff like that, pushing themselves into places like Spain, and even attacking as far as southern France. And then, of course, also in the early 700s, they're not only going west, they're also going east. They're going to reach the Indus River and take over some oasis towns that were major trading areas in parts of Central Asia. Here is a great map that we found that you can use to kind of put this all into perspective. Of course, the dark purple zone there in the middle is Muhammad's reign during the 10 years that he is coming over and ruling parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And then, of course, during the first four Islamic Caliphs that are going to take over after Muhammad, that area will spread through other parts of Eurasia and northern Africa, or northeast Africa, I should say. And then, of course, following some of your dynasties that we're going to talk about here in a minute, you've got some spread once again further out, and then eventually you've got up to 900, which is the really big push here for the Arab Empire. And when I say Arab Empire, it's not like the same kind of empire, quote-unquote, that like the Roman Empire was, or the Persian Empire, or stuff like that. In this kind of way, the Arab Empire is a little bit loose here. When we talk about the kind of empires for this, we really got to concentrate on caliphates or dynasties, and so we're going to do both of those things today. Of course, there's several motives for this war and conquest. The earliest one is money, right? I mean, you always want money when you're spreading an empire. Ways to keep it going, ways to get more tax revenue, whatever. So merchants are going to take this upon themselves to spread this empire because they want profitable trade routes and they want access to other regions that have wealth at some level, whether it's agriculture or tradable goods or whatever. Individually, you always have people that are looking out for their own self-interest with wealth or maybe social promotion. So you have to look at the social pyramid and what groups are going to want to try to do that. Usually it's people that are in the middle that want to improve their position. Of course, expansion is part of the common tasks of the Ummah, which you talked about in the religion PowerPoint. And that's pretty much going to be a really important thing to look at, especially when Muhammad dies, because it'll be one of those things that will need to be addressed as the main leader passes away. There's always a power vacuum, and what fills that vacuum here when Muhammad passes away is something that has to be addressed there. And then, of course, spreading the basic religion and faith and government types, that also is a motive here for the early Arab Empire. Conversion as part of that is really important. However, it's a really common misconception that the Arabs early on are trying to convert or kill everybody. In fact, that doesn't really happen. We don't see a lot of that early on. You do see some of it, but it's not as widespread as people would have you believe through popular misconception. In fact, all major monotheistic groups, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, those are all considered people of the book, which are given a certain protected status, once again, because they believe in the same God that Arabs do. It's not something where you have to convert these infidels or they need to be killed, right? That we see in other religions that treat certain groups that are not considered in the same realm. These are all monotheistic religions, so that definitely plays into this, but it still is a misconception here. We see a massive spread of Arab customs and Islamic tradition in the 400 years following Muhammad's death. You will see a lot of that happening throughout this quote-unquote empire. Of course, we need to ask a question here at this point. Why are people converting if I just mentioned that there's already monotheism going on in some of these regions? And so that there's not so much of a drastic change. Like when you go from, say, polytheism to Christianity in the Roman world, that's a major shift in how culture and society was. Same thing in the East when we talked about Buddhism and Confucianism moving their way over from, Central Asia over into East Asia. Those are major fundamental differences here. But these areas are already familiar with ideas like monotheism and heaven and hell and divine revelation and so forth, prayer, fasting, etc. Islam, though, is able to convert a lot of people very quickly because of wealth and prestige, right? It's that whole they puff up their chest and say to the world, we are a force to be reckoned with, and we need to be addressed with respect. And that attracts a lot of people. When you're successful, you attract a lot of people. Look at bandwagon fans for sports teams, for example, on a very small metaphorical scale. So a lot of that successful conversion and conquest looks at the power of God and how He can relate to people, universalizing religion, right? We talked about this in our Religions of the last unit. That's a very powerful deal. And there's also economic incentive for people to convert. This is a very powerful empire that's spreading very quickly. They're getting a lot of wealth and prestige through trade. They make people that live in their areas, therefore, pay taxes if they're not Muslims. It's called the jizya. And that tax on non-Muslims is something that people want to avoid, so it's just as easy to convert. Same thing with social mobility as far as an incentive. Non-Muslims can't hold official positions in the empire. So if you want to have that as your aspiration, you're going to convert. So we see a lot of that, and there's several reasons, once again, why. Now we got to start talking about, though, as we start looking at the spread of the empire. Once again, I already mentioned that in 632, Muhammad passes away, and once a very popular and major ruler passes away, we have seen already that could lead to a lot of different issues and conflict and even decline of empires, right? So the same thing happens in the Islamic world as well. There is a period, however, of 30 years where there's not so much turmoil. That's called the rightly guided Caliph period. And this is when the first four caliphs after Muhammad are in charge. Obviously, Caliph in this case is the political and religious leader of the Islamic community. That's a key term. You've got to know it. As soon as you see the term Caliph, you know you're talking about the Islamic world. Just like when you see the term Caliphate, Islamic world. Make no mistake about it, it happens nowhere else. Okay, so the first four caliphs are all really close people that were around Muhammad, his people that were his elders that he looked to and sought after for advice and stuff like that. They're all chosen by Muslim elders of Medina. The first one is Abu Bakr, who's basically the right-hand man of Muhammad, and he's a pretty good ruler himself there. When these four rulers start to kind of go through this time period and they start themselves, passing away, you start seeing a scramble here to take over. And that division of who should be ruling after the fourth caliph is going to be a very big deal. That leads us to a discussion of Sunnis versus Shias, which are the two groups that are going to come to the surface here for the jockeying for power. And basically the breakdown for them is pretty simple. They believe that there needs to be a ruler of this Islamic world, right? But how do we get to that ruler is the breakdown. Sunnis think that it needs to be the best Muslim. The best Muslim that the empire has should have the ability to be the leader, right? And so, it could be a military leader, it could be a political leader, whoever. It's chosen by the community. It's the most devout Muslim we can find. The Shi'ites, however, say that's not really what we need to do. We need to look at Muhammad and what he taught us, and we need to find descendants of him and have them do it. It's a hereditary breakdown, right? It's something that we've already covered with family lineage. So that's what they're looking at. And then, of course, that authority would come from the imams who help elect those people or get those proper people in charge versus religious scholars from the Sunnis. So here's some cool little facts for you to help keep that kind of stuff straight for you moving forward. That's a very big breakdown, though. That shift and that spread, I should say the divide, that divide of that ability or that belief system is going to be a contention spot for the Muslim world, even up to today, with ISIS and all the kind of stuff that's going on currently in different places in the Muslim world. Now, as we kind of have this dust settling here, you're going to go through some different periods where the empire will continue to grow, and caliphs that do take over for whatever different sect they're from, Sunnis or Shias, they're going to transform the empire from something that's very modest into a full-fledged monarchy, a powerful monarchy. Elaborate court rituals, bureaucracies that are ever growing, the first introduction in the Muslim world of a standing army, which is something that the Europeans were doing for quite some time, but hadn't made its way quite over to the eastern section yet. And then, of course, a centralized system of taxation and money to keep all of this going. Eventually, from this, you've got two ruling dynasties that come to control the Arab world, and those are the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty. You need to make sure that you now start to look at breakdowns for both of these dynasties. The Umayyad dynasty comes first, 661 to 750, so during that 90-year period, which is going to be a really vast expansion for the Arab Empire, this is where you start to see caliphs becoming hereditary rulers. So once I say hereditary rulers, you should know what they are. Sunnis or Shiites. You should already understand that based on the term hereditary there. The capital moves from Medina, where Muhammad had it for quite some time, to the Roman/Byzantium city of Damascus, which is in modern-day Syria. Very important city. And of course, as social pyramid speaking, you're talking about an aristocracy here made up of Arab military officials. So you start seeing the rise here of certain groups of individuals. Now, eventually that's going to fade away. There's an overthrow of this dynasty, this family. That family dynasty overthrow comes because of a couple of different reasons. The main ones are listed for you here. Basically, non-Arabs that make up a big chunk of this empire that have not yet converted but are paying their tax are definitely resenting their status as a second-class citizen, right? They can't hold office, they got to pay this massive tax, yada, yada, yada. Those are just two examples of that second-class citizenship. And then, of course, your Shia Muslims believe that some of these caliphs that are coming into power towards the end are illegitimate. So if the whole big deal is that they need to be in the family line, and that family line traces back to Muhammad, well, if some of those rulers are illegitimate, that kind of throws all of that out the window. So why not go back to the system that we're trying to get to, where you elect the best Muslim? And of course, we also got to talk about the lavish luxury here that these rulers are living in. Muhammad was a merchant. He was a poorer merchant when he first started. He became successful as a merchant, but still lived in mediocrity and a normal type of living arrangement. Now these rulers through this dynasty have become so lavish in pomp and circumstance that it's kind of being resented as being not true to Muhammad's teachings. And once again, the whole point of this ruler leadership chain is that this has to date back to Muhammad, and it should be somebody with the same kind of core values because they're in the family line. That kind of defeats the whole purpose when you're living in these lavish palaces and etc. So then you have your Abbasid dynasty. They're going to be around for much longer, 750 to 1258 pretty much, until they're overthrown by the Mongols, who we'll talk about later. These people in this dynasty are going to move the capital to Baghdad, which is a major city that we're going to look at later on down the road. Basically, you kind of appease your non-Arabs that were mad at the last dynasty. They now take a more prominent role. For example, Persian culture becomes part of the cultural elite of the Islamic world. They do have some political unity at first, however that doesn't last too long because there are continual breakdowns here between these two Sunni and Shiite populations. And then by the mid-800s you've got different groups of commanders and local leaders here kind of using their influence to gain some kind of autonomous rule over different regions. At this point we have to fracture the Islamic world into different sultanates, which obviously means that there's a sultan in charge. That sultan is the person who had that power and is now asserting it over an area. The official ending of this dynasty is 1258. And that's going to be studied with the Mongol discussion, which is a pretty cool story in itself. And no, we're not going to watch Aladdin or Mulan. We're not going to watch Aladdin. Some of those things are taken from this time period, but are taken way out of context. Of course, I always tell you to look at the role of women. The changing role of women as part of a cultural or social discussion is crucial to your understanding of this course in many different ways. For Islam, it's extremely important because obviously they're going to have some things that are happening in this empire and that are pretty unique. And so you've got to keep an eye on that. First of all, the spirituality of men and women as equal is pretty unique for a monotheistic religion. When you look at stuff like Christianity or Judaism, for example, men are the ones who are doing a lot of that teaching and spreading, right? Priests, leaders, rabbis, they're all men. I mean, they're never women. So that makes a big difference when men and women are socially and spiritually equal. Socially speaking, women are still inferior, so they're not totally equal. They should still obey men, obviously, though we have a mixture here in the Quran of rights and restrictions and protections that are going to be needing to be looked at and addressed by subsequent generations. However, there are some rights that women are getting, although they need to be subservient to men in marriage and stuff like that. They do have certain rights, like rights to dowries, inheritance rights, control over their own property, which is something that is kind of new for this discussion. Marriage must be consensual. It's not like before where it had to be consensual per se in certain other early monotheistic teachings, but it was still controlled by men, right? Like your dad wanted to marry off you to somebody else and all that kind of good stuff. That's a little bit different than what we're seeing in the Islamic world. And women can divorce men. That's a big one, especially if they're not being taken care of in the home. There are certain rights that women have here in a marriage. Some of those rights aren't maintained in other monotheistic religions. Growing restrictions-wise, there are growing restrictions during the Abbasid dynasty on women. Although the Arab Empire is growing in size and wealth and splendor for sure, role of women are becoming more and more limited. That applies especially to upper-class women. Lower-class women already don't have a lot going on for them, but they can't have servants. They have to leave the house for shopping or work. These restrictions are, of course, not based on the Quran itself, which is once again a common misconception, but definitely the cultural traditions that are within the Arab Empire in that world. Alright, going off of social stuff and the role of women, let's go back to the Islamic civilization here. Eventually, in 1258, of course, that empire falls apart and is taken over by the Mongols. However, it continues to spread as far as Islam and Muslim tradition for quite some time after. Even after the Arab Empire as we know it falls apart, major areas for expansion down the road include places like India, Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, West Africa, and Spain, which is going to once again get us into Europe. India is pretty unique because the Delhi Sultanate, which is circa 1300 or so, give or take, is something that needs to be addressed within your key concepts. That's one of the things that AP will expect you to know about. What is the Delhi Sultanate? They've asked essays about it, for example. Islam is brought over into India by Muslim Turks, and there is a lot of violent invasion, of course, where they are destroying Hindu and Buddhist temples in the region. However, the Muslim-led governments in India are going to have a lot of different issues in their own right, and so a lot of those things will be constantly in ebb and flow. One of the emergency things here, though, is Sikhism, which is a blending of Islam and Hinduism. Very important. Keep an eye on Sikhism because that's one of those little not heavily documented religion belief systems that is important down the road. Devotion to one God. Hindu concepts are all put together, and once again we have this blending here of two major religions. It's pretty neat to look at and study. Anatolia speaking, we've got the Byzantine Empire, once again, is starting to become very, very weak, and in fact, they're going to come and take over a lot of that area, especially in this region. This area is filled with Christians and Greek-speaking people. That makes it a lot easier to convert than India. India is Hindu-dominated. Multiple gods, big cultural divide, massively issues that are going to be taking place there. The Christian and Greek world, because they're already introduced to monotheism in the form of Christianity and Judaism, it's a lot easier to convert. So that's going to be really good for them to move over into that region. Eventually, you have the invasion by the Turks, which is going to lead to a huge cultural transformation. By 1500, just beyond this time period, 90% of the population here in this region is Muslim and Turkish speaking, which is a massive shift from where it was when the Byzantine Empire was over there in their heyday. West Africa, once again, trade is the very first way that Islam is working its way over into Africa, and conquest. Once the conquest does not work, the peaceful and voluntary acceptance happens through trade. Places like Ghana, Songhai, and Mali, for example, will become major urban centers of West African empires, and all of them will eventually convert to Islam. These cities become major religious and intellectual cities. Lots of stuff going on. Places like Timbuktu, for example, which is one of the biggest, best cultural cities in the world at the time, which is a really cool thing to say because we don't ever think about African cities as being cutting edge or ahead of the curve outside of maybe your early Egyptian talk that we had in the first time period. To the contrary, Timbuktu, for example, over 150 Quranic schools are set up. All of them are centers of high learning, and then libraries with tens of thousands of texts are put into this region. Giant mosques which rival any in the Arabic Peninsula world, and then, of course, with the adoption of Arabic as a language of religion, education, administration, and trade, you've got a merging here of a lot of different things that are going to make communication a lot easier moving forward. And then finally, we're going to come to Spain. Spain is conquered by Arab and Berber forces in the early 700s. Lots of movement in Spain, lots of birth of arts and medicine and architecture and all kinds of cool cultural things that are happening here. And at first, there is an awesome harmony and tolerance between Muslim rulers that have taken over this area and Christian and Jewish subjects, which make up a large portion of the population. Lots of freedom of worship, when the rest of Europe to the north is being very tyrannical and anti-mixing of culture and stuff like that. Iberian Spain, the Iberian Muslim world in Spain and Portugal, is quite the opposite, and it's really awesome to look at, and it leads to a lot of different contributions and growth of things like sciences, medicines, and all that kind of good stuff. And then, of course, that toleration does eventually come to an end. That's in the 10th and 11th centuries. There's a lot of warfare here where the northern Christian states are trying to get into Spain and obviously free it of these Muslim forces following the Crusades and all that kind of good stuff. There's a lot of contention between Christians and Muslims, and so more rigid forms of Islam come in to Spain from North Africa, and then now you have more radical Islam people in North Africa, and you have more radical Christian people from northern Spain kind of work their way back in. That's a lot of different sourcing for conflict there.